Right, so what I'm going to do is just ask you all to introduce yourselves, and if you can, you could highlight one tool that managers have in their toolbox that's of particular interest to you. So I'll start with Chris.
Yeah, I'm Chris Conroy. I'm from the Atlantic Salmon Trust, and I am the technical project manager for a landscape scale restoration project in Sutherland. I think the most important tool for me is the audit or fisheries management plan process to try and describe a catchment and assess the individual pressures. That's the first stage in the process, and to me the most important part of the puzzle.
Thanks, Chris. Can everyone hear Chris? Have you got a mic there?
Sorry.
That's all right. There's a couple of roving mics somewhere. So there we go.
How about you?
That should be good. If you give that one to Victoria, you've got one on, John.
I'm wearing one.
Super. I'll move on to Willie.
I'm Willie Yeomans. I run the Clyde River Foundation, and the most useful tool that we've had, apart from an incredible staff, actually, over the years, has been the electric fishing and the work that's been done at Pitlochry and amongst ourselves. You can get a pretty good black and white idea of how things are if you know where you are and you know what you're going to do there. So electric fishing is a big one.
Thank you very much. Keith.
Keith Williams from the Kyle Fishery Board and Rivers Trust. And my tool, I'm going to, just to maybe provoke some debate, I'm going to say hatcheries.
Would you like to expand on that, or are we going to keep that till later?
Well, one of the things you mentioned was appropriate use.
Yeah.
So, and maybe as numbers decline more, or we have issues like integration, maybe we need to revisit some of our thoughts on that over time.
Thanks, Keith. Sure that will provoke discussion. John.
Hello, I work for the Marine Directorate, and I'm the chair of the Wild Salmon Strategy Science and Evidence Board. And I think my magic tool will be improving buffer strips around the Scottish network of rivers and tributaries.
Thanks very much, John. Victoria.
Hi, I'm Victoria Pritchard. I'm a researcher at the UHI Institute for Biodiversity and Freshwater Conservation in Inverness. And at the risk of advertising our research, I'm going to say that new tools that allow us to use DNA in the environment to monitor invasive species and protected species, and also characterize the fish and the mega-invertebrate community in the rivers, can be new tools that can be proven very useful in the future.
Thanks very much. And last but definitely not least, Amelia.
Thanks, Ellen. I'm going to kind of reframe it a little bit and go for tools that enable upscaled action. So not necessarily tools that address pressures to salmon, but tools that address pressures to action more generally for improving habitats. And that would be, like we've talked about today, that the host of tools we're starting to see available for nature finance to enable funding into action. And also a lot of tools that are available now for stakeholder engagement and bringing together different viewpoints to make collaboration more possible. So things like the interactive games, etc.
Thanks very much. So now is your chance to get involved in the discussion. I do have the option to bring some of the chat from Slido in earlier on, but if you'd like to raise your hand, if you would like to either ask a question of the panel or indeed ask for views of a specific management measure that you may be interested in. So does anyone like to kick us off in the discussion? Yes, please go ahead, Rebecca. Is it Rebecca?
Rebecca Lewis, Scotland. Well, thank you. Hi, my name's Rebecca Lewis. I'm the Scotland Northern Ireland manager for Buglife, the Invertebrate Trust. So clearly my question is going to be around invertebrates, and I'm familiar with a few faces here. As a tool, I guess that's our focus. We're looking at that entire trophic layer, which we see as a foundational thing for, the health of our rivers in general. My question is, where would you place that as a tool? I was pleased to hear the work that's going on at UHI, which we've been involved with as well. And where would you rate it in the proceeding of things? Because it's something that we are always trying to promote and have concerns that it's not high enough in consideration. So yeah, I guess I'd like a very brief answer from everybody if that's not too greedy. Thank you.
Who wants to kick us off? Go ahead, Chris?
Oh.
Oh,
Well, I'll start. Yeah, I agree. I think it's important, and it's potentially really an overlooked aspect. I admit I've only really just started to appreciate how important it is now that we are working on the invertebrate eDNA stuff. And yeah, because the invertebrates are the food source for the juvenile salmon, right? And for example, we don't know there's livestock medications, and there's, for example, medicated grit used for game birds. We don't know how much that's washing into the streams and how that's impacting the invertebrate communities there. So that's, yeah, I agree with you.
and there were some studies recently that suggested that some of the tick treatments that dogs and domestic pets are routinely given are showing up in rivers as well, which I'm sure has a large bearing on invertebrates. Anyone else from the panel? Chris?
Yeah, I think it's a very important part of the picture. On our own project, we're using eDNA to look at macroinvertebrate populations, and we're also taking physical samples, which I do need to get to you, which I haven't yet, but I have got them. So, I mean, in terms of an early indicator of change or response to management actions, I think it's a really important part of that process. And you know, in the fisheries world, we concentrate very much on the impacts of temperature on fish during the summer, but during the winter, we're seeing increased winter temperatures, which can have impacts on those cold water invertebrates. So, yeah, I think it's a really important tool to monitor change and to look at the efficacy of your management actions.
Great. Anyone else from the panel?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Chris has said. And one of the problems we're all thinking about metrics for green finance and things like that. Migratory fish might be quite a poor indicator of some of the things because they happen to move around a lot, and perhaps they're not the best things, whereas invertebrates obviously move, but probably at a much lesser degree. So we've used, even back in my old PhD days, we were using inverts then because it was actually a lot of the things with the fish were harder to detect. Stable isotope analysis showed stuff in invertebrates that it wasn't showing in the fish in the same place, for example. So I think it's an overlooked tool. It's something we all tend to overlook but should use more.
Thanks, Keith. Willie? Oh, sorry.
I will say, actually, not just prey. I mean, for example, we used to have masses of pearl mussels in salmon rivers, and now we haven't, and they are important ecosystem engineers, so you know, we don't know what impact that's had.
Willie?
Well, we started training our staff to do family level macroinvertebrate work in about 2005, and I've maintained that since, and we have one person that I would consider to be an expert in-house who can go right to species level. We've had a lot of practice. We have something like 500,000 animals in the Hunterian Museum that we've collected over the years. I'm interested in it in particular because we have urban rivers which aren't the cleanest sometimes, and I'm interested in water quality. Not just for salmon, but for other things as well. And the two things that when we took it on initially, I'll confess this, it was more or less to embarrass SEPA to turn out to some of the pollutions we had. I don't apologise for that, and it's true. More recently, we've been doing a lot of quantitative survey samples and things, looking at the channel, the new channel that I showed you on the slide there, monitoring the colonisation of that channel, because nobody else is monitoring it. And if I'd spent £4 million on that, I would want to have some kind of handle on how successful it was. Because we had salmon spawning there very quickly, but nobody knew what they were going to be eating. And we still don't, because we haven't processed the samples, because we haven't been paid for it. But they're in the archive.
John, Amelia, do you want to come in on this? Or?
Yeah. I think, I mean, diversity of invertebrates is obviously very important. But I think what's equally important and really difficult to put numbers on is the availability of food items, actually, is the density of invertebrates. And I think it's one of these issues where there's a shifting baseline. And actually, if you talk with the youngsters of today, they don't remember when you could drive and have to clean your window screen every 20 miles to get the flies off. They don't remember. But there have probably been huge changes, and these might be behind a lot of the production of salmon in freshwater systems. So it's probably part of quite a big picture of how do we reverse the damage, actually, that's been done by modern farming methods. And I suppose I should pass on to Amelia then, because I know she's working on some of those issues. But regenerative farming, I think, is very exciting, for example. And it would be lovely to see some example catchments where these approaches could be applied and we could actually measure and see what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think reducing fertilizer use or integrated pest management plans in conjunction with, something that I hear talked about quite a lot is this debate of a metric for measuring water quality and what that's going to include. And I absolutely think that a measure of invertebrates should be part of that discussion because it's such a good indicator of success of trying to improve habitats in rivers. But I think it's also a good indicator of efficacy of things like these regenerative land management practices that we're trying to implement as well. So, I don't have any answers to that question on the water metrics thing. I know it's a hot topic at the minute, but it is something to think about as well, and that invertebrates and invertebrate surveys, which Forth Rivers Trust, we're lucky enough to have a specialist as well that can go out and do those samples so that we can kind of compare that on certain sites with our e-fishing data. And we can look at year on year after we've implemented large woody debris or a project in river, what the impacts are actually having on those populations. So,
thanks very much. Well, related to that topic was one of the questions that we got in Slido earlier on, and since John mentioned it, I think we'll revisit that one, which was from Duncan Pepper, which is talking about buffer strips, and maybe we won't talk about why we're paying farmers to do that because that's more of a policy issue. But what more can we? What would be the ideal situation in terms of buffer strips, and what would they look like? Would they just be simply areas of land next to the rivers which are untouched, or actually does it need to be more than that? Is it the roughness and the planting that's in those that needs to be taken into account? So, John, since you brought it up, I'm going to go to you first.
I think there's really good questions. I'm not sure what the answers are. There's certainly some academic studies on buffer strip widths, which I can't say I can remember off the top of my head just what we're looking at, but it's probably we'd want wider buffer strips than we could ever likely have. So they're going to be compromises. But certainly I think you'd want to be looking at least towards the 20 metre rather than 2 metre side of things. But maybe beyond the buffer strips, there is this issue of what happens beyond the strip. I mean, buffer strips are great for looking at shading by the river, for filtering out, but best if you don't have too much to filter out in the first place. And of course, buffer strips don't solve everything by any means, but they're a huge, important step in the right direction. And I think if we looked at a river network as a network of long grasses and shrubland along the banks of rivers and tributaries, we'd be in a much better place than we are today.
Great. Back to the audience. Any other questions for the panel? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, it sort of carries on from the discussion about buffer strips. I am approaching the end of my 6th decade working on the Tweed. So I was there before we joined the Common Market. As soon as we joined the Common Market, intensification just rolled on. And I think there was a suggestion from Pedro that perhaps some of the farm subsidy could be used to maintain buffer strips. But there was a huge injection of capital from the Common Agricultural Policy as it was to dredge rivers, straighten them, and drain wetlands. In one river in the catchment, there was 11 square kilometres of wetland drained, and it's now arable.
Yeah.
All arable. So my contention would be that part of the sub, and I think they were talking about 70% for farming and 30% for public goods. 30% of 600 million is 180 million a year. That's a huge sum of money, and we could do some great things with that.
Yeah.
So that would be one of my suggestions. My question relates to cool, clean water, which is mentioned in the Agricultural Act as well as in the implementation plan. What is the panel's view on using groundwater to cool some of these smaller streams in the headwaters where the spawning takes place and the young fish grow on?
Who would like to answer that one? Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I think it's quite complicated when it comes to using groundwater, because if I'm not a hydrologist, but groundwater temperatures can be pretty steady, I think, and you get those changes throughout the year within those water courses. So you'd have to think carefully about whether that could interfere with the sort of natural cycles of the salmon. But it all depends on the profiles of those groundwater temperatures. You know, I've got previous experience working in the south of England where you had chalk streams, and they are pretty regular. They do vary a bit, but pretty regular temperatures. So I don't know if anyone else has got anything to say on that.
The only thing I will say is that there has been some discussion with obviously it would be better off if we didn't have a river with a hydropower dam in it, but there's certainly, I know there's discussions about how water release from the dam could cool the river and help the salmon, help mitigate high temperatures below the dam. That's the only input I have to that question.
Yes, but one of the reasons I raised it, we've got a tributary of the Tweed that's in a steep-sided gravel valley, and the temperature maximum in that is 14 degrees. When the river is running at 24 degrees, and it's because of the groundwater ingress. And it's one of our most productive salmon rivers. So it was just an idea. Can we use a small amount of groundwater in some of these headwater streams to cool the river, to cool them, just to keep them cool? And it's something, if we plant, we're going to be waiting 10 years for shade or something like that. This could be done quickly, and it could be switched on and switched off as required, and it could be solar panel powered. So it's maybe an idea that's a bit too far for you. But
I think, no, I mean, the whole idea is to try, we've got a list of the known possibilities. The whole idea is to tease out some new thinking. So I think it's brilliant. Thank you.
I think it's a very interesting idea as well. I think I've worked in chalk streams in the south of England as well, and there are places in the chalk near Wantage where the rivers came out of the ground out of a pipe, and they would augment them during summer, just not for any particular reason other than it keeps some water in it. Yeah. So it could be done theoretically.
So that term cold, clean water keeps coming up. So just going to ask everyone now, can I ask you to raise your hand if in your local catchment you're actively thinking about measures that you can put in place to mitigate the effects of climate-induced warming on rivers? Good number of hands going up. It's kind of what I expected to see, but it's good to see that that happening. So since Keith mentioned it, let's get into the thorny issues. And for the panel, what do you think the role of hatcheries might be in modern fisheries management? Anyone? Everyone's sitting on their hands very, very carefully right now.
I don't mind.
Go for it.
So I think, it's a bit of a Marmite question, isn't it? And hatcheries, there's a lot of people very pro-hatcheries, a lot of people very anti-hatcheries. I think there is a place for them in the right circumstances. I think ideally you want a self-sustaining natural population of fish, but that isn't always possible. So I think the key question with hatcheries is the methodology used to assess whether it's the appropriate tool or not within that on that particular scenario. And I think historically we haven't necessarily taken that approach. It's just been go for the hatchery.
Yeah.
Whereas I think we need to look at the causes of the issues, and we need to basically go through a tick list before you get to that point.
So at risk of putting words in your mouth, it's not the first tool in the toolbox.
No, it's not the first tool in the toolbox. Yeah, no.
I would agree with that. So I was just going to say I would agree with that, but one of the reasons why I raised it was I see it creeping back into people's thoughts, and I gave an example of where a hatchery hadn't worked in the way it was meant to. We reckon there's over 50 million fry put into Loch Shin and ended up with less than 50 adult salmon coming back a year. But I was struck by what somebody said many years ago, because there's so much evidence against hatchery use, and particularly in terms of the genetics. But given that there might be perfectly legitimate reasons to use hatcheries in a targeted and usually a time-limited way, shouldn't we be working on making them better and trying to get over some of the genetic things? In the last few years, we ran a hatchery on the Kyle. We ran it very differently than it would have been a long time, trying to do our best to look after the genetics and things like that. But I'll just finish by saying, I mentioned the Merkland end of our catchment, and that happens to be where the genetic integration seems to be the highest. And I mentioned that the numbers of smolts coming out of there is going down. So could we look at using a hatchery to try and boost the wild population, to screen for fish farm integration, for example, and try and get the wild populations up there robust enough to be left alone again and to do their own thing? Sorry, John.
So I'm going to bring Alan in, and then I'll come to you, John.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Alan Kettlewhite, Argyle Fisheries Trust. Just bringing up into the new kind of scenarios that we're seeing on the West Coast, our populations are pretty small anyway. We've got quite a few populations, but they're small. Now, we're starting to pick up indications that some of these populations are really struggling. They're disappearing from headwaters, and we're getting down to possibly in the next generation or two of salmon, where we're going to have populations of less than 50 fish. You know? And so there could be a role for hatcheries to try and better understand, alongside the other tools of genetics, using genetics to better understand where we are within a river system and what we think is the right thing to do. But I think there are those other tools that we've been mentioning here, alongside very targeted use of hatcheries, where it might be one of conservation's. Because I think all the actions that we've been taking about trying to buy time for salmon to be able to adapt to the new regime at sea, etc., and finding the right animals that are going to survive. So I think it may have a place in the future, but it needs to be a very, very targeted, very well researched and possibly licensed, the way we go forward with that.
Thanks very much, Alan. Good segue, I think, to John there.
Yeah, so I suppose along similar lines, really, if it might be that it is sensible for some of these very weak populations to retain the freshwater locally adapted genetic material, which one can do now with gene banks, just using sperm in a pretty limited area. But you need to get that material back in again if you're going to rebuild a stock. And I think that's where hatcheries might have quite an important role to play.
Great. Any more thoughts on that? Yeah. Victoria.
I would say a very important consideration if you're considering hatchery supplementation is you definitely don't want to be impacting the survival of the wild-spawned juveniles, because even if you're as careful as you can be with your hatchery plan and your breeding plan, still you're going to get some sort of hatchery selection. You're limited in the number of parents you can use, and anything that reduces the survival of the wild spawned fry, it potentially reduces the genetic contribution of wild spawning parents, and also it interferes with the process of natural selection, which could be helping adapt salmon to their new environment. So I would say be very cautious on that, especially. And I will say also, I think it's actually to have a targeted hatchery program to try and breed out Norwegian genes from your population. It would actually be quite hard, because once you get a few generations down the line, you can't actually, it's very hard to disentangle the Norwegian genes from the wild genes. And more important is to stop those genes going into the population. You know, once they're in there, it's possible that natural selection might eventually select them out.
Yes.
Gareth Pedley, Wild Trout Trust. I'm quite interested that obviously Keith's example you showed that the hatchery didn't fix the problem, but finding what the actual bottleneck was has actually seen a bit of a reverse in that decline. And I think that demonstrates how important it is that before you start going down the hatchery route, you have done your best to find what those bottlenecks are, to create something that might actually be a sustainable solution, because if you don't know what those bottlenecks are, you can chuck as many hatchery fish in there as you want. You've still got that problem. So to me, I would actually say it's almost the opposite way around. The hatchery needs to be pretty much the last resort. You need to try and exhaust all of the other options to try and recover your wild fish population first.
I wouldn't disagree with that. Obviously, I'm slightly playing devil's advocate, and I'm slightly more than slightly playing devil's advocate. But I see it in my sort of peers. I see that people are under pressure for instant results all the time, and I see it. I'm not being critical of them, but I see it creeping back into people's views and what they're doing. So I think it's important if we do use them that we're clear as to why we're using them and what the actual result is. Just as I gave a very good example there. When you start adding up what went into Loch Sheen tributaries, over 50 million fish wasted in my opinion. It could never solve the problem because they can't get out of the dam. That's the fundamental problem. So I agree with you, but obviously sometimes a hatchery could potentially be a useful tool, but you also need to speak to people like Victoria, because we might think we're getting around a problem, but we could actually be making it worse or creating different problems. So yeah, I agree with you.
And I will say a few examples that have recently been cited as hatchery stocking being good. We actually don't know what would have happened if the hatchery stocking hadn't happened. So, because it's really done in an experimental manner when you get two equivalent watersheds, one of which is stocked and one of which isn't.
Yeah, thank you. Willie?
I'm almost obliged to point out that we have a river with plenty of salmon and it's never had a hatchery.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to move on to something slightly different now. After 2027, we'll have a new round of river basin management plans in Scotland. So what are the key changes that you think you would want to see to benefit rivers and fish in terms of the approach that's taken in that next round?
Well, as you know, I speak to you a lot about the river basin plans and SEPA and other things. So, and I broke off from yesterday afternoon's meeting to speak to somebody in SEPA. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic because and too grumpy, because myself and Willie have just done a fine job on the optimism slot. But
Who'd have thought that?
Who would have ever thought that would have been in the sentence? But as well as the plans are fine, but we get frustrated at implementation. And enforcement was mentioned this morning. And it should always be the carrot that comes first. It should always be that, for lots of different reasons, many of which were spoken this morning. But occasionally you need the enforcement as well. And it's just about the determination to get things done and to help. And I know it's complicated. And I know it's not easy, but again, the frustrations of my career as it comes to the end is we're still dealing with many of the issues which are solvable, which were there at the start of it, on lots of different river systems. So as well as whatever the plan says, and I think it can do better and we can do more in riparian buffer strips and all these sort of things. It can help with all of that, but there needs to be the determination to actually get the things done and to use the stick occasionally if it's necessary. It needs some grown-up conversations, which I don't think have always been there today. Anyway, I'm starting to make myself unhappy now, so I'm going to stop.
Well, let's try and turn that round again, get the optimism back up. But in terms of those buffer strips, obviously, as one of the regulatory tools that SEPA has is the general binding rules that sets out all sorts of criteria in relation to buffer strips. But what's never been clear to me is whether complying with those general binding rules is enough for wild salmon. So I don't know, Roy, if I don't want to put you on the spot, but are you in a position to come in?
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, really appreciate you asking that question. So for those of you who don't know me, Roy Richardson, I'm the River Basin Planning Manager in SEPA, and I sit on the Wild Salmon Strategy Implementation Group with Alan and quite a few people in the room. I mean, yeah, there's a lot I could say. No, really appreciate the kind of the question, because we are thinking hard at the moment about how to review and update the river basin plans. You know, we've been working for over 2 decades towards those statutory deadlines, and I think as we heard in this morning's session how useful statutory deadlines are, and they've been incredibly useful in driving improvements, in driving regulatory action, and there's been a lot of both protection of the water environment and improvement in the water environment that's been driven by that over the last 2 decades. But now I think the challenge is how you go beyond that and how you look at land use and land management, because I think that's the remaining kind of challenge or gap that needs to be addressed. When it's a shame in Willie's presentation in the Clyde catchment, he referenced 4 projects that SEPA have delivered or actively been involved in delivering to open up the catchment, but we don't hear the kind of the positive side often of a lot of the work SEPA does. And John Swinney this morning referenced the barrier removal programme in the River Basin Plan, and we've already opened up over 1,400 kilometres of river. And I know we've got difficult situations like the one we've been talking about, Keith, and I know you've been talking to our fish ecologists about the projects up in Sutherland. But we have had to prioritise and focus on the big river systems and the large amounts of but yeah, there's a lot of delivery, but there's still a lot to be done. This is turning into a long answer. In terms of water quality, clean water, raw diffuse pollution is the biggest problem by far. And we've made huge progress with the priority catchment work. And again, I don't think that's the awareness of that is kind of high enough, or the recognition of it is where it should be. I mean, those are over 50 catchments now where a team of SEPA staff have been out working with the sector, working collaboratively with the sector to drive up compliance rates with the rules around diffuse pollution. So we've gone from a situation back in 2010-11 where the compliance rates were around about 30% with those regulations, to now, after literally tens of thousands of farm visits across 50 catchments, the compliance rates are now up around 80%. And we're getting to the point where we've probably delivered as much as we can with regulation, and now it's about choices around how we use land and the impact that has on the quality of water inland, how you use soils, how you use fertilisers, pesticides. And there's only so much that regulation can do in that space. And I think it is about how we fund and support and incentivise farmers and land managers. So quite a long answer, but there will be consultations and engagements around the review and the update of the river basin plans coming up. And I'd really welcome the involvement of this kind of community in that to make sure we get that right.
Thanks very much for the answer, Roy, and especially since I put you on the spot. So that's really good of you. And we really should celebrate that vast amount of habitat that's been opened up through that work, because that is an instant win for salmon and other migratory species. Amelia.
Yeah, just to come in on what Roy was saying on the priority catchments thing, just to say that the SEPA were instrumental in the work that we did in our Leave-in Lens project, because they fed into, the Leave-in's a priority catchment, and the priority catchment officers fed into what we were doing in terms of target areas and who we should be working with and the things that they had learned from their priority catchment work. So that link was key there in actually taking what they'd done to that point and trying to push it even further. Another point, to go back to buffer strips, and sorry to change the topic just slightly, but there's some really good research that's come out of James Hutton Institute on 3D buffer strips. I just wanted to throw that out there as a fun thing. And that's all from me.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That was what I was hinting at when I was talking about roughness of buffer strips earlier on. But yeah, it's really important. It's not just the width of that strip. It's what it looks like. It's how it's planted. It's all sorts of elements. So just going back to the other element that Roy was talking about, and I guess it also reflects what we were talking about earlier on in terms of EU subsidies and things like that. One of the things I found quite strange is the lack of join up between the general binding rules that SEPA work under and then the rules, say, under GEEC that reflect the single farm payments, and they don't always just quite match up. And I always felt there was a real opportunity going forward to link subsidies to farmers with compliance with all of these rules, including SEPA's rules, and actually getting that whole join up across the piece. Because if we want to change behaviour, certainly what's coming into a farmer or any other person working within a catchment, if it's affecting what's coming into their pockets, that can be a really, really powerful way of doing it. And I'm viewing that as a carrot rather than a stick. You know, you do the right thing, you get your subsidies. So it's maybe something that's worth thinking about for the next round of river basin management plans as well. Anyone else from the panel?
It would be quite nice to see what the targets are. I mean, I spoke about targets in terms of numbers and sizes of salmon, but what would we want land to look like for salmon? What could we achieve? And this is something we talked about with Roy, actually, in relation to opening rivers up. What have SEPA achieved in terms of smolts produced? Is a metric we haven't worked out yet. And I thought there's some really inspirational talks this morning. Fantastic how quickly things are moving. But what could we achieve? If we had some goals, maybe that would be useful in terms of the next basin plan.
Great. I'm conscious of time, but I'm going to take, if anyone's got a question that they want to put into the mix, I can take one more. No? In that case, I'd just like to end this session by thanking the members of the panel. Thank you for your time and thanks for the questions.